This episode of the Sam Oldham podcast is sponsored by Turn, the only brand dedicated solely to men's gymnastics. Towards the end of my career, I started to work closely with the team at Turn to design custom uniforms that expressed who I was and where I came from, and they were always able to bring my ideas to life. For years, I wore uncomfortable gymnastics clothing until I started to wear Turn, whose uniforms are built with their attention to detail and quality in mind. Go check them out now at turn-gymnastics.com. and enjoy the episode. In June 2024, the men's US Olympic gymnastics trials took place, and the 5 men that will compete for a medal in Paris have been confirmed. Frederick Richard, Brody Malone, Paul Judah, Asher Hong, and Stephen Nedorosik are the team tasked with battling it out in France. I'm joined in this episode by Kensley Beale, who's been doing an incredible job keeping the men's gymnastics community informed thanks to the Neutral Deduction social media channels and podcast. Today, we're going to preview the Paris Olympic Games, and this is our story. Kensley, it's great to have you back on. You will see that I'm in my England shirt because last night something very, very special happened. England got to the final of the Euros. The UK and England are two very different things for my American listeners that might be watching this. I actually looked at some stats the other day. The second biggest audience base we have is the US. And the Olympics is big, but if you're from England, winning a football tournament that is either the Euros or the World Cup is literally the biggest sporting event biggest thing that could ever happen. So I'm very excited, super positive, but today we're going to talk gymnastics. First of all, how are you? The first episode did really well, so thank you for coming on. We had a great response. It was very interesting to have that chat with you, and we're kind of getting two sides of the lens, aren't we, really? We're getting the athlete's perspective, but also kind of the journalist and the analyst's perspective, which is really cool.
Yeah, I'm so well. Thank you so much for having me on. I am also a bit tired. I was working with NBC for the very first time, so I was on the broadcast side of things instead of the journalism side of things. Long hours, but an incredibly cool opportunity to see the world of gymnastics through an entirely different lens that I had never experienced before.
Was it a big change? What was the big differences there, Kensley, in terms of like the work that you were doing, going from like the analysis to the broadcasting side?
Yeah, lots of differences. So for regular journalists, you only get access to one of the practices for Olympic trials, but in the broadcast, you get to actually watch all of the practices. So just from a time perspective, that was different. And then my job at NBC is I'm the direct researcher for Justin Spring, who's a 2008 Olympic medalist, and Laurie Hernandez, who's a 2016 Olympic medalist. And so my job is to help make sure that they have correct statistics to share on the broadcast. So it's a mental mind game to like be able to keep up with who has done what and what are the top scores this Olympic cycle and things like that.
Yeah, that's an amazing, we had that conversation the last time off air and you told me you were going to be doing that. And I had said before we went live today that I'd been with some of my friends recently and they were talking about the TV coverage in the UK and, they have some frustrations with it. And I said that, well, over in the US, they have specialist analysis working with the commentators who are feeding them that information, and they couldn't believe it. They were like, wow, that seems so professional in comparison to what we're doing over here. So yeah, very exciting. You're going to have an amazing seat in the house at the Olympic Games in Paris. I'm sure as a gymnastics fan, it feels like Christmas. So yeah,
it does.
I'm personally very jealous too. Kensley, let's start then with the US Olympic trials. Let's pick up where we left off. Did anything happen in the lead up to day one between the US Nationals and then the Olympic trials with any of the main contenders? Was there anything in terms of injuries or anybody doing different apparatus or choosing to do not as many apparatus maybe? Or was it pretty much just plain sailing for everybody and everybody turned up fit and healthy?
I would say for the main contenders, things were mostly as expected. I think Joshua Carnes, who was one of the gymnasts who's on the senior development team, so one of the younger gymnasts, he showed up and decided to only compete 3 events. But for the most part, people came ready to compete exactly what was expected of them.
Yeah, well, that's great. And there was quite a gap, right? So it's quite difficult in that period where it's very high pressured, lots of stress, quite intense. You know, you've done probably 6 months of very difficult loading to then stay fit. It almost becomes a game of make sure you don't get injured in this period of time, which can be quite hard as the athlete because, you know, what you don't want to do is step off the gas so much that you're not doing enough work, but you don't want to be overloading it because you feel a bit nervous. So it's a very hard thing to navigate those gaps between Olympic trials. Going into day one, Kensley, what was the competition set up like? So in terms of, was it men and women competing at the same time over the weekend? What were the crowds like? I guess, was there any differences from the US nationals in terms of how the competition was running itself?
Yeah, it was actually the setup was the same. So typically men compete on Thursdays, women on Friday, men compete their day two on Saturday, and women get that prime time spot on Sunday evening. So that was the same.
Okay.
But I think in an Olympic year, so the fans who are based in the US are avid fans, and many of them are going to the Olympic Games, which of course is extremely expensive, not only from a ticket price, but from airfare and getting hotel. And then of course they also want to be at Olympic trials. And so I think the audience was a little bit weak at the national championships, and you could see that on the broadcast. And this typically happens in an Olympic year. There's just too many competitions for people to go to, and they have to just pick and choose what their favorites are. So while there were hardly any people in the audience for the national championships at the Olympic trials, they were selling out like 15,000, 16,000 seats. And I was actually telling people, because of my, like the other part of my life, I research musicians' health. And so one of those things is noise-induced hearing loss. And my Apple Watch was going off constantly about the decibel levels and the high risk of noise. And I kept telling people, please bring earplugs to the arena, because the roar was deafening. It was unbelievable, and nothing like I had ever experienced at a gymnastics meet.
Wow, amazing! And what were the athletes saying about that atmosphere during the weekend and afterwards, Kensley? Did they enjoy it? Did they like it? Did they find any elements of that quite difficult and challenging in terms of how tough it was to compete?
I have only heard positive things from the athletes. Of course, I'm sure there are maybe some people who had a fall who, they didn't enjoy it as much maybe in that moment. But the person for me that I think it affected the most was actually Shane Wiskus. So the Olympic trials took place in Minneapolis. He's from Minnesota. And so is Suni Lee. And so the roar for the two of them was almost as big as the roar for Simone Biles. Wow. And that was just something really special to experience. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about Shane's performance, but you could just tell how much the crowd was like lifting him up and encouraging him and helping him through this very important competition.
And did those large spectator figures translate from men and women? So was it equal across the board?
Yeah, the first night of men was a little bit less. I'd have to go back and look exactly at the numbers, but I want to say it was maybe around like 12, 13,000. And then for the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it was sellouts, I believe.
That's amazing. And is that typical for like US Olympic trials? Yeah.
Yeah, I've only been to one other Olympic trials. I went in 2021, which of course was still in the height of the pandemic. But it was sold out. It was extremely rowdy there as well.
Yeah. So day one then, the competition, Kensley, who for you stepped up and who maybe faltered on day one?
I think for me, Shane Wiskus and Paul Judah really stepped up. They were incredibly consistent in the all around. And so coming into the Olympic trials, the highest scoring team was Brody Malone, Frederick Richard, Koi Young, Yul Moldauer, and Steven Enderosik. And I would say for many people, we believed that was going to be the Olympic team. It was one of the highest D-score scenarios. It was a very strong team, a team where everyone had won a world medal. There were going to be a couple Olympians on that team. And Koi just really took himself out of the running, had a couple rough days. And so following day one of competition, it was Brody, Frederick, Yul, Steven, and then actually there was an exact tie with Shane and Paul on the team.
Okay, wow. So, yeah, and in terms of just you touched on it there. What mistakes did Coy make? Because just for everybody listening, I wasn't able to watch the whole broadcast. I've only been able to watch the very few limited routines that are on YouTube. So, what were those mistakes on that first day?
Yeah, the biggest mistakes really came from him on pommel horse. So typically he's competing a routine well into the sixes. He only got credited with a 5.3 that day. And then, of course, just wasn't able to continue to perform well and ended up with an 11.65. And really, Coy is the reigning world silver medalist on pommel horse, is typically scoring in the high 14s, if not getting into that 15 mark. So you're looking at least a 3.5 point deficit to what he normally can do. And he also had a little bit of a falter on high bar. So high bar is not one of his strongest pieces of apparatus. Those are vault and parallel bars, but he ended up scoring in the 12, about a point. So really over the first day of competition, he's losing like 5 points from where he really needed to be.
And so essentially, Coy on his big events, he has to hit, because the other events aren't going to bring his all-around score up if he has mistakes on those strong events, right? So he was having to hit, and it seems like the key really for him was probably that pommel horse routine.
Yeah, I had heard that he was really struggling with stamina. I believe pommel horse might have been his last event or one of his last events. And just once he got there, it had been a long day, and he just wasn't able to put it all together. But of course, right, people had believed that Coy would effectively replace Stephen, because the senior selection committee hadn't been shy in saying that they really didn't want to put a one-event gymnast on the team when you only have 5 members available. And so, again, Coy, having been the reigning world silver medalist, being able to score in that high 14, 15 range, well, if he starts not being able to perform, that elevates actually the importance of the pommel horse specialists like Stephen Adrosik and Patty Hoops.
Yeah. Was there a change, Kensley, in equipment from US Nationals to Olympic trials, or was it the same? Was it the same?
It's still Spieth, which I think, is another question mark of how are they going to do once they get to the Olympics with the Gymnova equipment. And you would be able to speak better to this, like for pommel horse, what are the differences between that Spieth equipment and the Gymnova equipment?
Massive difference. So as opposite as you can get for two pieces of equipment. So the Spieth pommel is a very shiny leather. It's very hard. It's the shape is more circular on the edges. And so the fact that it is a little slippy, it sometimes can be a problem. So you will quite often see gymnasts slip on their travels forwards and backwards because it's thinner and it's slidey anyway. So your hands sit in a different space. They kind of curve around the outside, whereas typically on a Gymnova pommel, it's a lot flatter, it's wider. There's not as... It does curve, but only slightly, but it's more rigid. The way I would describe it is it's very boxy, very square. The handles are essentially feel like and are wood, whereas the handles on a Spieth pommel are more like fiberglass, plasticky. So very different. Essentially very different pieces of apparatus. So it will take some adjustment. Normally speaking, I believe it's easier to go from Spieth to Gymnova than it is to go from Gymnova to Spieth. So it's safer, if that makes sense, going the other way around, because the pommel is wider. There's more room for error in terms of the actual shape of it. That's my personal opinion. But if you go from a Gymnova and you're used to having like good grip on the leather to Spieth, it can feel a bit wild in those first few sessions, especially if you're doing skills like, which a lot of the Americans do and everybody does. If you're doing like the woo or the Roth, they can feel very different on a different pommel horse. Whereas the handle work, there's more room for adjustment on the handles because you're using your fingers to grip more, right? So you can kind of squeeze and hold on and adjust as you're going around. Whereas if you're off a little bit with your shoulder and your alignment on those traveling skills where you're turning and doing Russians, it can go wrong very quickly. So yeah, I would say it is a big difference. And the apparatus where it's the biggest difference is definitely pommel horse. The other apparatus, not necessarily too much. The vaults are very different. So the Spieth vault is very soft, so you almost have to go in and come out, whereas the Gymnova vault is quite hard, so it's a quick reaction time. So that changes your block, especially if you're doing a handspring vault. If you're doing a Yurchenko vault, it doesn't change it too much. And then in terms of the high bar, a Gymnova high bar is a lot more rigid, more solid, stronger, harder to move, whereas a Spieth bar moves a lot more. So a Spieth bar is more similar to an AAI bar. And then rings, they're both pretty similar. Rings isn't going to be too much of a difference. The only thing that people tend to struggle with a little bit on Spieth rings is the actual lever that connects the ring to the chain or the wire. Where the lever is at the top of the ring, it's a very wide, thick piece of leather, and it can dig into people's elbows a little bit. So you often find when a gymnast do a press to handstand, the elbows will go a bit, they'll almost bend a little bit, and they'll lose their stability because of that thick piece of leather that sticks out. And I never used to like doing, I used to do a guzogi on rings. So like a double backflip between the rings. And sometimes when I do it on the Spieth rings, the triangle that connects the wire and the lever would wrap around and it would fold up and it'd be upside down. So I used to have a coach stood next to me around 2014 time to shout, yeah, you're good, or no, you need to get off the rings, which is a design flaw that I'm not sure whether they sorted out or not, but yeah, it was a very dangerous design flaw. But yeah, that's kind of the general gist. I went in pretty in depth there for you, but hopefully that helps with the Olympics coming up as well. For
me, definitely. Of course, I definitely have never done ballboards. So hearing you explain like what it's like to do these skills is actually incredibly helpful for me.
Yeah, it's a great question as well. No one really asks that question, so it's a very good question and very timely, because you are right. It's something maybe I haven't thought about since you've just said it. They are going to struggle adjusting to that equipment if they've not been training on Gymnova back home. And typically, Gymnova is more of a European country thing, I think. So, it's based out of France. So in America, you probably wouldn't compete on it very often.
No, they definitely have a few pieces at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center. And I do know that the Olympic team is going over a little bit early. They're going to be training in one of the French gyms, as I believe most of the competitors are. So hopefully having that few extra days of adjustment will help.
Yeah, I think a week to 10 days is normally enough, and you can adjust the equipment pretty well in that time. You need a few days in the beginning to kind of iron out the kinks. You need a few days to kind of get rid of the jet lag, which is another thing that obviously the American team are gonna have to deal with, whereas the British team won't. It's pretty much the same time zone. But yeah, normally 7 days to 10 days is enough to kind of get used to the new equipment, and then you start to understand it a little bit, because everything's different. The timing, the bounce, how hard it is, how soft it is, even the colours, the colour of the floor, spotting the floor, everything's a little bit off. If it's a competition like the Olympic Games, it'll be brand new equipment, so the mats will be rock solid. They won't have been worn in at all, so it'll take the first week of training for them to become a bit softer and be a bit kinder on the joints and stuff. So really interesting question there around the equipment, because that is a big thing that I guess when you're watching on TV, you just expect, well, they can do a routine on anything. You don't really think about, oh, wow, they're going to have to really learn how to use that different type of equipment. I mean, it's the same in any sport, right? Like I've watched the football last night. Pitches are different, but pretty much grass is grass. It can be harder or softer, or maybe it's raining or whatever, but with the gymnastics equipment, just the smallest detail can make a massive difference. What would you say then in terms of who was going into day 2, who was holding on to their plane tickets and trying not to lose them after day 1, and who was trying to take them off those people in those spots potentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the two people who were really locked in, there was going to be very, very little that they could have done to lose those spots, barring like injury or true catastrophe, were Frederick and Brody. Like they were locked in. They had done enough. I think Steven was holding on for dear life, trying not to lose that spot, because if he had fallen and not been in that top pick, I believe after talking to the selection committee that it actually would have gone to discretionary selection, not that automatic lock, which of course we can talk about in a few moments. And then I think Yule was sort of holding on again to his spot, and The person who was sort of kind of coming up, they were sort of like passing each other at a crisscross, was Asher Hong, because Asher is a gymnast who sort of peaks really at that last moment.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, they had this really long selection procedure. So a lot of these gymnasts were competing in the NCAA season, so they had to peak in April for their NCAA team. And then at the end of May, they had to peak again for nationals, which was 50% of the selection. And then they came down in July, beginning of July, they had to peak again for Olympic trials. And then the Olympics were 3 weeks away. And so I guess a question on my mind is, I wonder, did they have to peak too many times? Is that too much to ask from the athletes heading into the Olympics? Whereas like the British team was selected in April after Euros.
Yeah.
And then they have this long time to come down and build back up. And again, so as an athlete, what would you prefer? What are the benefits or negatives of each of those systems?
What is the most challenging is, if you want to compete in Olympic Games, the time you have to peak is the Olympic Games, but you still have to get onto the team in the first place. So that is your biggest challenge. You're fighting against that all of the time. In terms of the British team, I think that was probably, if I'm honest, in terms of the early selection, more than anything was dictated by the fact that we don't have a lot of gymnasts at the moment. Because typically in the past, those selection competitions were a lot later. Now, I don't know how early that decision was made in terms of bringing them forward, and essentially the team was pretty much selected after the British Championships, if not the European Championships, because there had to be a change of personnel last minute. But it was picked pretty early, so you're right, that is early, and the counter-argument to being settled and being in the team is you've then got to hold out, keep training, and also bring yourself up to the right level ready for the games, and that can get quite hard to do when there's peaks and troughs of training. I think for me personally, in 2012, it suited me perfectly because I was playing catch up. I was in the middle of December 2011, I still wasn't allowed to train. I had to have 8 weeks complete offload, and they were not letting me do anything. I wasn't even allowed to do a handstand. So for me, having that very late Olympic trials, I needed that because there's no way I could have got ready in 2 months it just wasn't working, So for me, it worked perfectly. But then for other gymnasts, it can be a challenge. There was a gymnast at the time, Ruslan Pantelemonov, who was on the team that won the gold medal at the Europeans in May. And for him, you would probably look and say that was too long for him to hold on, given that he was already in his late 20s. His body wasn't as young as mine. He didn't have the numbers and at the longer that selection process went on, the better and better I got. So a little bit like one of the questions I was going to ask you Kensley, was how do you feel about Frederick and Asher peaking very well for Olympic trials and then now trying to peak again for the games? Do you feel like maybe actually, after US Nationals, you might have been thinking, wow, they've had some mistakes or they've struggled a little bit. Asher's kind of out of contention, but maybe they've timed it actually spot on. Whether or not that was a conscious effort by their coaching teams or not, or it was just something that naturally occurred, it seems like their timing was, pretty much perfect. And they'd done enough at the first competition. I know Frederick was going to be in the team no matter what, but Asher in particular, he did just enough to stay right there in the fight, and then pulled it out the bag when it mattered right at the end.
Yeah, Asher's an interesting case because he really does seem to turn it on under really, really high pressure situations where you typically see a lot of athletes maybe falter under that pressure. It seems like he just thrives there. But I really do think that he had basically taken himself out of contention at the national championships. And I think if Yule had not had such a terrible fourth day of competition, I don't think Asher would have been able to make it on the team because they were sort of fighting for a similar spot.
And in terms of Yule, how was his day one and then how was his day two, Kensley? Because obviously he's not made the team. Maybe it's the US Gymnastics YouTube channel. I'm not sure who it is, but there's no videos of him to watch. So can you just tell me about his performances over the 2 days?
Yeah, his day one was, I would say, maybe like a lower normal, but within the realm of normal from what we see from him. I believe he did have a fall on pommel horse, but other than that, if I'm remembering correctly, there wasn't a lot wrong. Of course, I had to actually go back and watch a lot of these videos because when you're in the broadcasting booth, it's just number. And so I actually couldn't remember a lot of what had happened. But his day two, the big area that I really think threw it away from him was his parallel bar routine. It was really not up to the level, right? He's someone who can make an event final, who was scoring 15-4 both days of nationals, and he got a 14-1 day two. And then his pommel horse was, I think maybe he had 2 falls on pommel horse, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's just, those were key events that he was needed on. And it just, I don't know if it was fatigue. I don't know what it was because that's so unusual for him. If there was one athlete that I was going to say, maybe 2 athletes on the U.S. team that I was going to say, these guys just hit every time, I would say it's Brody and Yule. Like, those are the ones that you count on. And
what was the atmosphere like on day 2, Kensley? What was it like? Was it, obviously the arena, I'm sure, was buzzing, but was it, you're sat there, somewhat of a bird's eye view, seeing the coaches and the athletes? Did it feel tense? Did it feel relaxed? What kind of an atmosphere was it?
From my perspective, it was tense. Everyone knew this is the Olympic team's going to be named. It's going to be named at the end of this competition. And so if you're someone like Yule, who has been on the highest scoring team since the first day of nationals competition, and you think all I have to do is hit, maybe that gets in your mind. I don't know. I don't know. Was it fatigue? Was it his mind playing games? I can't say. I haven't spoken to him about that, but there was such an energy in the crowd. It was very tense, and mistakes do happen under those circumstances.
When you were watching it, Kensley, could you identify clearly athletes that were using that crowd and that momentum and going with it, and then athletes that it was kind of like they were like almost falling under that pressure a little bit?
Yes. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Shane Wiskus was just like, I don't think I have ever witnessed such an inspired performance, because when I had spoken to Shane last year, he had told me he didn't think he was continuing in gymnastics. He was so hurt and so injured. And I actually had left him off of my preview, I think in January, talking about anyone making the Olympic team or alternates. I was like, he's not coming back. He had pulled out of Pan American Games. And to see an athlete go from, I don't think I can do gymnastics again, to having one of, if not the most inspired performance using the crowd that I have ever witnessed, that was one of the most incredible things I've seen. Asher Hong, his vault, like he'd been kind of struggling with his Rise Guang vault, and he came out of the box day 2 and got the highest score by like a point that he had gotten over the other days of competition. And that really helped solidify his spot on that Olympic team.
What was, just quickly, Kensley, I saw a clip of what was the Stanford coach referring to when he was talking about the scoring in the US and the vault scores with Asher, because it seemed to me like he was being quite sarcastic. And he was essentially saying, the judges in America are so good that they can spot every small... But what he was saying was, these scores are so low and internationally he's going to score a lot higher. Am I right? Have I interpreted it in that way?
I think there is generally a perception that the judges in the U.S. are among the best judges in the world. They're, right, one of the American... Well, he's now with Trinidad and Tobago, but is American Steve Butcher, right, was writing the rules. So they have someone sort of on that inside able to confer, like, what are the rules? You have Dan Bachman, who's done, I don't know how many Olympic Games, Butch Zunich, again, another Category 1. And so I think there's this feeling that they see this really high-level gymnastics on a consistent basis, and that they don't miss deductions, whereas maybe other judges from other countries do miss some of the common deductions. And I can't say that that is a prevalent opinion among all of the judges. So
Yeah.
please, if you're listening to this podcast, please don't come after all the American judges. But that certainly is an idea that is prevalent there.
Okay.
I think there's also right, different judging panels they're arranged differently. So in the US, the way that they arrange judging panels is they choose the D and E judging panels at the beginning of the Olympic cycle. And so there's the same judging panel for all 4 years. And so they get very accustomed to judging together and understanding how each other are going to judge. And right, if there's judging evaluation programs, and so you have to stay in range with the judges on your panel. And so if you get used to knowing where the judges are going to fall, you feel pretty confident in being able to take deductions. Whereas on international panels, the D score panels are assigned well ahead of time.
Yeah.
The E score panels are drawn the morning of. And so, right, everyone knows Zhou Jingyuan is the best parallel bar worker in the world. And everyone says, how on earth can they find 8/10 of deduction? There's maybe 3. I mean, really, there's in many of his routines, maybe 3/10 of a deduction. And I have personally spoken to judges who have judged him who have said, we weren't sure about the panel. We thought that they would go 8/10, so we took 8/10 as well.
Yeah.
And so you're dealing with, when you have a panel that you're not used to working with, you kind of err on the side of often generosity.
Yeah.
Because if you're out of range with the judging evaluation panel, you can lose your ability to judge.
Yeah.
So there's several different things going on at once. And so going back to what happened in this process for the US team, the 6-0 vaults were being absolutely nailed. I mean, they were just being torn apart left and right. And when you look at how the vaults are being scored internationally, they're being scored like at least half a point higher. And so I think that was the frustration of, it's not that the deductions couldn't be found. Like this is not a Marian Dragulescu, Kyle Schufelt issue that happened in the 2004 Olympics, where they literally gave Marian Dragulescu a completely impossible score, and then like those judges were suspended.
Yeah.
These are not impossible scores that the American judges are giving to Donnell Wittenberg and to Asher Hong. But the frustration of Tom Galini, the Stanford coach, is what he's saying is, this is going to affect the team selection.
Yeah.
Because they're not being judged the way that they're going to be judged internationally.
Yeah.
And so the 5-2 vaults are scoring the exact same, if not higher, than the 6-0 vaults. And that's probably not going to translate on the international stage.
Yeah, so even if everybody doing those 6-0 vaults, and I say everybody, let's say it's 2 gymnasts, the judging is consistent, the scores aren't reflective of what they'll get internationally. So then when the selectors are taking that into account and it's adding up into a team score, it is impacting the selection of the team. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's probably quite useful for people to understand that as well. So in terms of the team that was selected, was the team the best team mathematically selected in the end?
In terms of overall D score?
So how did they do that, Kenzie? Did they go with mathematically the highest D score combined with an E score? Or was it just purely the finish score, the best team result mathematically in terms of the finish score of the top 5 and the makeup? How did they go about that? Because my first impression, without knowing what had happened and seeing the team, was that on the outside, it looked like they selected a team very much to go up against the British team, because they picked a pommel guy, they had a strong vault and rings guy. Like it seemed very much, because it was a different team to what you would have imagined after the US Nationals, it looked to me like, well, they've done a U-turn and they're trying to go toe-to-toe with the British team and like match up with them. I obviously know that, it seems like the general consensus is from people that I speak to that aren't from the US system that they picked a team based on maths, essentially.
Yeah, there was no picking of the team. There were different scenarios predetermined by the coaches, the athletes, the selection committee, and then approved by the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And so this was actually, I think, the least likely scenario to happen. I really thought it was going to go to discretion. And I believe like this was the only team that could have mathematically locked. Like it was very, very, very close to going to discretion. So they took the highest scoring team using all 4 days of competition, and then the highest scoring team using the best 3 out of 4 days of competition for each athlete. And if those teams matched, there was no selection. Like that was the automatic team, and that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
The team had just mathematically locked itself. And I think that Stephen did himself a huge favor in hitting 4 routines. Now, he didn't hit the 4 routines he was supposed to hit, but he did he did stay on the pommel horse for 4 routines in a row. And a lot of the main key players like Buell and Coy fell. And that meant his scores were way more important because some of the other athletes like Asher and Frederick they're not bringing in big scores on that event. And so here, that's how a one event athlete ends up being so important to the team mathematically.
And was that the only way that it would have been an automatic selection? So the 4 scores, so 4 competition scores as a team, and was that the only way it would have been an automatic lock?
No, there was one more way it could automatically lock. And again, I don't think that the U.S. Document has officially come out yet. So I'm just using data that's been collected by other people at this point. But if using the 4 days of competition and then the 3 days of competition, if those teams had been different, if there was a team, one of those teams was 2 points or more higher than the other team, then that would have automatically locked the team as well. Okay.
So really, having one bad routine was the big difference there, because ultimately if they're going for how close those scores are with the 4 days and 3 days, essentially one bad routine is putting you out. And that's probably what happened, right? With a few of the gymnasts.
Potentially. I mean, remember Asher
would that bring your average down considerably? Let's say, for instance, Coy goes and misses pommels, Yule misses pommels, then the score that between the 4 scores and does that pull it down considerably?
It sort of depended on which routine you missed, right?
Okay.
So if Coy missed still rings, that's not really going to change the team. They're never going to use him on still rings, right? But if you're missing on your key events, that's going to drastically, potentially drop you out of the running.
And was it, Kensley, was it the best 4 for 3 apparatus or for 4 apparatus? So for the qualification team score or the top 3, so like final score, does that make sense?
Yeah, so they had something in their document about using the 5-4-3 scenario in qualification and then the 5-3-3 scenario that's used in team finals, but ultimately it would produce the same score, right? It's the best 3 scores
because you
counting.
dropped that 4th score.
So, so they had that written out in their documentation. So, but the team is. I'll be very interested to see how this team will perform at the Olympic Games and to see how they will stack up against probably who I think are the other bronze medal favorites, Ukraine and Great Britain.
Yeah. What were the standout routines for you, Kensley? Obviously, you talked about Shane, and we can briefly talk about, obviously, he put out a very classy post, having not made the team, and I actually think that there have been a lot of those posts, similar post from James Hall in Great Britain. It's very easy in that situation to make it personal, but it never is personal between the athletes. The athletes don't pick themselves, do they? Their performances do, but, it's either a selection committee or it is, like in the US, an automatic selection this time around that picks a team. Just tell me some of the standout routines and then just talk a little bit about Shane missing out and how upset, other people were because we maybe had a similar response to Courtney missing out in Great Britain.
Yeah, so some of the standout routines for me, I think Frederick Richards' day 1 floor routine was exceptional. Definitely a routine worthy of being in event finals. He's got difficult tumbling and executes it so well. And I think that's a routine to watch. Asher Hong's vault, his day 2 vault, is one of the best Risaekwongs I've ever seen him do. I've seen him do one better, maybe 2 better. At the World Trials in 2022, he just like stuck the heck out of that vault, and that one's gone viral multiple times. That's probably the best I've ever seen him do. I thought, it's so hard. For me, Shane and Paul Judah, who we haven't actually spoken a lot about, who is actually on this
I know.
team.
Yeah, we did that. I did that, I made that mistake again in the last episode, and, having watched a little bit more of his gymnastics, it is aesthetically beautiful, his gymnastics.
He, for me, is one of the most clean and beautiful gymnasts in the world. I love his gymnastics. And so watching him hit the pommel horse both days, and then his day 2 vault, he didn't quite stick it. It looked like he was going to stick it, but just the emotion, and he sort of knew in that moment he probably was going to make the team. And I want to talk about Paul for a moment, and maybe I said this in the last episode that we did, but Paul Judah won that +1 spot for the U.S. team in 2021. He risked COVID to go compete in South America at Pac Rim, or maybe Pan Americans, and he placed in the top 2 in the all-around, and he won that +1 spot that was then later awarded to Alec Yoder. And then the U.S. men's program did not even name him to the national team after he won that spot. And it was like a scandal beyond scandals. I mean, there were articles written out the wazoo about it, and he was obviously extremely disappointed, and he just worked so hard to come back, increase difficulty, and to see him then earn his spot on this Olympic team after what happened in 2021 and that devastation was one of the most magical things I've ever seen. I mean, he was so emotional and just an incredibly humble human, and I couldn't be happier for him.
Do you think that automatic selection process, having the criteria already decided and it's essentially nobody's picking it, the team should pick itself, suits somebody like him that maybe doesn't do the most difficult gymnastics but does beautiful gymnastics and is more consistent?
Potentially. I mean, him and Shane they're similar gymnasts in many ways, and I think it was sort of a toss-up as to which one of them was going to actually get that spot. And for Paul, I think one of the things that would have gone against him, maybe had it gone to discretionary selection, is he had downgraded his vault. So last year at the World Championships, he performed the Yurchenko double pike, which is a 5.6, and he ended up hurting his elbow on it earlier this year and said, I'm not going to be performing that routine anymore. And he went back to the 5.2, the cross 1.5. And that's sort of been one of the downfalls of the U.S. team over many years, and something that we'll talk about is potentially a downfall for this U.S. team at the Olympic Games, is last year they brought 2 5.6 vaults and a 6.0 vault. Massively different than their typical lineup of all 5.2 vaults. And as we know, vault is the highest scoring event. It's the one where they don't take as many execution deductions. And so I think that potentially could have worked against him, and maybe had it gone to selection, they would have said, nope, we're still going to take Coy because Coy has a 5.6 vault, and things like that. Right.
And then just a word on Shane, just obviously, he'd spoke about finishing at the end of last year. He's done, I imagine for him in time, he will look back at those US Olympic trials and be like, that was my Olympics, like that, the way I finished in terms of that last Olympics and that period. I think he'll obviously look back competing in front of essentially a home crowd and having that experience. And, the way you've spoke about his performance, that's what sport's about, right? Like people going away and, you should have seen the way this guy performed. It was unbelievable. I'll never forget that. It was just amazing. It was kind of like a moment. I think that sometimes resonates with people more than just somebody that maybe just wins medals, just always wins medals. You quite often talk about, I wanted that guy, because you resonate with someone's story, right? So just, talk about Shane just a little bit, and then we'll move on, Kensley, to the other teams, I guess.
So I think the thing that for Shane was probably so devastating. And again, I haven't spoken directly to him, but if you can imagine, you finished this meet in front of your home crowd. I think he maybe stuck his vault at the end. It was the dream. It was the performance that you dream of. And you look up at the scoreboard and you see your name in third, right? It's Frederick, then Brody, and then yourself.
Yeah.
And the crowd is behind you. And you knew coming in that you were tied for the highest scoring team, right? You have to imagine that he in that moment felt, I've done enough. Right? And then you go back to the selection room and they read off a list of names and your name isn't called for the team, but then it is called for the alternate. And that drop of, I think I've made the team in front of my home crowd, to I didn't quite make the team, but I'm sort of part of the Olympic team. So in the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee recognizes alternates as Olympians. Of course, he's already an Olympian from having competed at Tokyo, but it's sort of like this weird gray area where you're allowed to say, yes, I was part of the Olympic team, but you weren't in the Olympic Village. You didn't compete at the Olympics, right? And then you have to go to media and you have 1,000 people asking you, how do you feel about being named an alternate? And he just kept saying over and over, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb. And he finally got to the point where he told one of the other journalists, I'm not answering your questions anymore.
Yeah.
And then he chose not to show up for media day the next day and just to fly home and be with his circle of support, right? And that's a massive emotional roller coaster to ride, right?
Yeah. Yeah, very difficult. One of the best pieces of advice I got given once was, if you've had a bad competition, go and have 10 minutes by yourself before you talk to anybody in terms of media or press, just to calm down and don't go into that room like angry or stressed or just, in that situation. You're right. Being asked to do that is very, very difficult. We wouldn't have that here just because, to be honest, more than anything, it's just not as big. We're not going to get 16,000 people watching, and it's never on mainstream television, the British Championships. I mean, it's been on maybe once or twice in the past, around 2012 and 2016, but it's not anymore. So you wouldn't be put in a situation where you'd have to answer those questions as a reserve. But I can completely resonate with how he was feeling, having been in that position in 2016. But yeah, incredible performance. And everything that I was reading on Twitter about it, people were, disappointed just because he'd done so well. But the great thing for him is that he is already an Olympian, right? And that does make a difference. And I think one thing that might make it easier for him to take is if they have gone off numbers and maths. You can't argue as much as somebody's opinion, right? So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. The team that's selected then, Kensley, what are your expectations for them going into Paris?
I don't know what to expect, to be completely honest. I'm very curious to see how this team will perform. So I think that right, Brody is Brody. Brody rarely misses. He did have a miss on high bar at Olympic trials, but like for the most part, Brody is that athlete that is going to go in and he's going to hit no matter what. And that's going to be what you see from him is what you always see from him. I am worried about Steven Edorosik, and I think I'm not the only one who's worried. He, of course, world champion, fantastic on this event. I never, ever want to take away from how good he can be on this event. He has a 0% hit rate in international team finals.
Yeah.
Of the 2 international team finals he's been a part of, they have not gone well. Even through this Olympic trials selection procedure, like they had planned for him to compete a 6'2". I think like one day at nationals, it was like a 6'5", and then it was a 5'8" one day at Olympic trials and a 5'9" one day. And he like just didn't do the routines that had been expected of him. And that's, I think, a common problem is I don't know if he doesn't remember or gets nervous or just feels like in the moment, oh, I can't do these skills. And so you don't know what routine is going to come from him. And is he going to be able to hit it? And that's when you're brought for one event, that's a scary place to be, right? I think overall the team is likely still the favorites for the bronze medal, that they are not as heavy favorites as I think many of the Americans think that they are.
Yeah, I think I would agree. And, I explained I'd gone to my friend's birthday and it's a lot of gymnastics-y people there, and I sat back and I listened to the conversations, and a lot of it was, interesting team selection, not confident in Stephen's ability to hit under pressure in a team final. He hasn't done it twice. And I think the tone's changed a little bit from them being firm favourites to, I think Great Britain's stock and Ukraine's stock's gone up a little bit. That's kind of my initial reaction to it. And then you add in the different time zone, different equipment, it plays a factor. So, that will be very, very interesting. But I think the biggest mystery...
go ahead.
Sorry, carry on, Kenzie. You go.
From a difficulty perspective, it's actually Ukraine that's in the driver's seat, which I was not expecting. But the difficulty that they have added in, not only from last year's World Championships, but from this year's European Championships, where they won the Europeans with a score high enough to have won the World Championships in 2023, they have added like another point and a half in difficulty, and they still have more in the tank to add. And I think for me, like, the issue with Ukraine is like they're a total wild card. You never know if they're going to hit or not. But they have a lot of big routines, and if they hit, they actually have the D-score advantage right now, potentially over the U.S. Now, the U.S. can add another half a point of difficulty on just pommel horse alone than what I'm projecting that they're going to be doing. But Ukraine is right in there. And don't forget, right, Russia is not able to compete here. Reigning Olympic champions. They're at war with Ukraine. I think Ukraine's going to be very motivated to say, we're going to take your spot on the podium. See how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, I'm sure there'll be a massive... there'll be media favourites and there'll be fan favourites in terms of what's going on politically between those two countries, and that will play a factor 100%. And I think you're right, and like I was saying to you before we went live, I think free up, free to count favours Ukraine quite heavily. I think it's difficult for them to put 5 up 4 free, but free up, free to count, I think in terms of a difficulty, I think they'll be able to quite easily put 3 very strong D scores on those apparatus. It might depend on health of their older gymnasts who are quite senior now in terms of Radovilov and Vinayev, but I'm sure they'll be doing whatever they possibly can to make sure they can compete on the day, whatever means necessary. And even high bar, they've struggled in the past. But I tell you, one gymnast I was very impressed with was the young gymnast on their team at the European Championships. His line was beautiful. So I think he will...
Radomir.
I think he will compete very well at the Olympic Games. And I think on the international scene, his gymnastics will do very, very well. They have such a rich history, Ukraine. And they always produce quite interesting and exciting gymnasts. All the way through when I was growing up, there was lots of interesting Ukrainian gymnasts. Valery Goncharov competed in Athens 2004. Very interesting combinations on high bar, amazing on P bars. Roman Zazulia, again, was a very interesting gymnast growing up. So they just have such a rich history with teaching very good technical gymnastics, and it makes sense, right? Many of the athletes that won Olympic gold medals for the USSR were from Ukraine, so that makes a lot of sense. Atlanta 96, the Ukrainian team were very, very strong. I think they won an Olympic medal, if I'm right, in 1996. So I expect them to be strong. And, I've talked about them being like a team of Avengers because they're all such different builds. They're you've got Radovilov that's 10 feet wide. Then you've got the young guy who's tiny, he's like a stick. Then you've got Oleg who's massively receding and his butt is super small and he's got a tiny waist. And then they're just such an interesting... And then you've got literally... Kovtan, who's just huge and it doesn't look like he'd be able to do that kind of gymnastics. It doesn't work. It makes no sense. He's massive. He doesn't look like a gymnast. Right. He looks like an athlete or a boxer or something. It's it's really interesting. So they do just look like a team of Avengers. It's quite a cool team makeup. What do you think to the GB team selection then, Kensley? That hadn't come out the last time we sat down and it came out just afterwards. What was your initial reaction to it?
Oh, pure shock. I had tweeted something after Europeans, and I was like, I wonder if they will go in that fifth spot for someone like Courtney or Luke. And I was like, no, they're definitely going to go with James. Like, he's the consistent all-arounder and whatnot. But seeing them actually choose Luke, it was pure shock. Of course, devastation for Courtney, because I had really wanted that for him. I think he's not only a fantastic gymnast, but a really nice person, and that dedication to try so many times. Like, you want them to be successful. It's very similar to Donald Wittenberg in the U.S., who has tried so many times. But yeah, pure shock. And then I thought, so I guess before European Championships, right, Max had pulled out due to injury. We didn't really know what the injury was. And now he's competed a couple of times, and it hasn't really gone very well. He did one routine with a 4.8D score, which is 2 points below what he's normally doing. And then he competed at a French friendly with a 6.60 score and a 3 execution, and ended up getting something in the 10s. And so I'm really curious to throw this back to you and say, where is this team going to land? Because you've got some gymnasts who are really inconsistent. You've got Max, who's typically very consistent, but seems to be struggling with an injury.
Yeah.
Do you think one of the alternates is going to end up coming in? Like, do you think that they're going to be able to perform consistently? It seems like Harry and Luke also have had some struggles, particularly on floor. And so I don't even know what to expect from this British team.
Yeah, I would say out of the 3 teams, and it's hard really to know too much about Ukraine because there's not going to be a lot of information coming out of there. But I would say the biggest mystery is the British team. It's hard to know. It's very difficult to know, even if you're in Great Britain. Unless you're maybe one of the competing athletes still and trains at one of the clubs of the gymnasts that are on the team, it's very hard to know what's going on, and I am somewhat out of the loop. The last thing I've heard is that Max is hitting routines in training. So full difficulty on pommels in training he's going through. In terms of the makeup, I think, given the fact that they picked the team so early and the selection policy was based off up until the British Championships, because Max had hit 3 out of 3 very good routines, they selected him based off the criteria, which is good, but I think they've named James as the reserve because he's there ready, waiting if something happens and somebody's not ready. He's the next best all-rounder that's going to go in. So it is a very interesting team selection. In terms of, at the start of the year, I did a podcast and I spoke about, who could potentially be on the team for Great Britain. And I said, you never know. You could have somebody that comes out of nowhere and takes a spot. That often happens in an Olympic year. It's normally a young gymnast that's maybe a little bit naive and just, they don't really understand what's going on. They just go for it. Like, they've got that recklessness of being youthful. And I think in terms of Luke, you have to give him a round of applause and say, wow, you were given an opportunity last minute and you literally took it by beating the Olympic champion on floor. It's pretty incredible. And it's not a floor routine that's without the risk in that floor routine, right? It's huge. So the fact that he had that opportunity, took it, became back-to-back European floor champion, he almost made it very difficult for the selectors not to pick him. What that looks like, given the fact that really he went to the Euros as the floor guy, how many apparatus is he going to be able to do at the Olympic Games? Has he had enough time to prepare in that time frame to the point at which you'd want to be prepared for an Olympic Games? I don't know. What's the makeup of the team going to be like in terms of the order that they put up? It's difficult to say because I think there are a few niggles going on in terms of people having issues on certain apparatus and maybe not being able to do certain routines. It's hard for me to know for sure. But from what I am hearing is that Max has gone through pommel routines recently in the last few weeks. So I think he's going to compete, and I think the team will stay as it is. I don't think James will get called up. I'd be surprised if he did. And actually looking at the American team that's been selected, I think if I was on that British team, I'd be a bit more optimistic about looking at that team final. And it's a team with a lot of experience, right? You've got Max, you've got Joe. it seems to me that Harry isn't phased at all about competing under pressure on the international scene. To make 3 apparatus finals at the age of 19 is pretty impressive. In terms of his demeanour, he just doesn't look like somebody that's phased at all. Some of his decision making is very impressive in terms of, you know, he chose not to compete on some apparatus at some of the Olympic trials because he was so confident that I don't need to do that routine. Like I've already proved what I can do. So, yeah, pretty impressive. I think Luke, again, is going to be, he's got nothing to lose, right? Start of the year, if you told him he'd be on the Olympic team, he probably wouldn't have believed you. So that's an amazing place to be in going into Olympic Games. And then Jake seems to be getting better and better all the time. In terms of floor and vault, obviously Jake, particularly on vault, is a massive favourite for a medal. And you could almost argue more than Max at this moment in time. So it's hard. The big argument in Great Britain's been, have they selected a team to win as many individual medals as possible, or have they selected a team that they feel can do well as a team and also get individual medals? The noise that's coming out is that, no, we picked a team that can get the best team result. Everyone's kind of smiling and going, no, you didn't. You picked for individual. So it's interesting. That's kind of like the consensus of everybody within the gymnastics community that I speak to, is like, it was a team picked with maximising individual medal success. But having said that, I do feel like, looking at the American team, and when they get to Paris, regardless of what the selectors want to do or what the coaches want to do, the gymnasts are going to want to go out and try and win an Olympic team medal. So, it will be very, very interesting. And I think, the team that was selected has really thrown it up in the air massively. I think it's quite open, that third spot now.
Yeah, originally when I saw the British team selected, I think, like many people, I was like, oh, they're not really going to be in the running for bronze. But now that I've sort of run the numbers and seen who the other teams are, I'm like, they're actually really not out of it at all. And they have the strongest floor lineup of any of the top 5 teams, like by a lot, actually. Like, their lowest difficulty floor routine that's expected to go up is a 6-5, and that's insane to say. What an incredibly strong group there. And then, of course, on vaults, you've got that 6-0, 5-6, 5-6 lineup expected to go. And that's, wow, it's such a powerhouse team. And I'm really excited about them. And then, of course, Max on an individual level could potentially become the first gymnast to win 3 golds succinctly on one event. Wow, what a storyline that is.
Yeah.
There's so much good in that British team, and I'm really, really interested to watch and see what they're going to be able to put up.
I think, as quite often it does in men's gymnastics, Kensley, it might come down to pommel horse, and I would give Great Britain the upper hand at the moment. Jake is looking very consistent, so if Jake goes up and hits maybe even if he hits a high 13, low 14, puts the pressure on. Depends a lot on in which way you qualify as well. Let's say GB and America qualify in 3rd and 4th and they're going up together. If Max goes up and hits a 15, Joe goes up and Joe can get close to a 15 if he's consistent and he hits a nice routine, and Jake goes up and gets a 14. All of a sudden, if you're America, you start thinking about, what happened? If there's one mistake, there could be 2 or 3, and then so it's going to be very interesting to see that dynamic in a team final.
Yeah, I think so. The U.S. team did pretty poorly on pommel horse last year at the World Championships. They just got really lucky, and everyone else did really bad on pommel horse too. And I agree with you, because if you think that Japan and China are probably going to qualify 1st and 2nd unless China implodes again, or maybe 1st and 3rd, something, China doesn't necessarily always do their best in qualification, and then you've got 2 of those 3 bronze medal contenders starting probably on pommel horse, maybe a floor on a pommel horse. Yeah. That means one of those 3 contenders is going to be ending on pommel horse, most likely. That's a terrible place to be. Like, that's really frightening, I would imagine, to say we're going to end on pommel horse and it's going to be the last routine. But that's what happened, I believe, in 2008, was Sasha Artemev for the U.S. team was the last athlete up on pommel horse. They were the last routine to go. Everything was dependent on him, and they did come away with the bronze medal. So it can happen.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. It's going to be a great, and it always is, like the team final in the men's side, it's the best competition to watch. It's so
I think
close,
so.
you know, in historically speaking, and it's a little different now because I think the gap's closed considerably and there's more depth on the women's side. But on the men's side, it is always 5, 6, even 8 teams. They can be competitive if they hit clean routines. When you look at the other teams, I noticed today, again, following your social media channel, Neutral Deductions, Kensley, I've seen that the Spanish team's been selected, so that's all 12 teams have been finalised. Just a little bit on the Chinese team. We spoke to Catherine from Magnastics. She was very complimentary of the Chinese team. She actually felt that, in her personal opinion, she would kind of back them for favourites, potentially going into the Olympics in Paris. Where do you see that Chinese team sitting? They obviously didn't pick their national champion to be on the team. How do you feel about their team?
Yeah. I think Catherine had maybe made that prediction before the Chinese team had been selected, potentially, because I think they made some strange selections for their team. And having learned more about the selection process and how political the selection process is, and it's about which athletes come from which provinces, not necessarily what athletes are going to make the team. And someone who is very familiar with the Chinese system said that it actually matters more to them which athletes win potentially that gold medal than them winning the gold medal necessarily, which I think is really interesting, should that be true. So the team that was selected was Jung Bohang, who of course is their best all-arounder. He was the one who was sort of snubbed in the 2021 selection process. Zhou Jingyuan was the only person to automatically lock in and earn the spot. Parallel bar extraordinaire for sure. Xiao Ruotung, who is the reigning Olympic all-around silver medalist, and then Sun Wei, longtime favorite, and Liu Yang, who is the reigning Olympic still rings champion. So the team is interesting for a couple of reasons. So they chose Liu Yang, who, again, reigning Olympic still rings champion, almost to the detriment of the team. So they have Lan Qingyu, who is also a still ring specialist who can compete just as difficult a routine, score just as well, who's also a fantastic all-arounder. But Liu Yang typically scores just a hair better in international competition. And they have said that their basically top priority is to retain the still rings gold over Petronius. And they feel like Liu Yang can give them that. So right. Liu can also sort of compete vault, sort of. It's not great, but you don't really want him to do that. So he's effectively coming for this one event, which means that the other athletes have to fill in. So they've got 3 all-arounders, 1 3-event specialist, and 1 1-event specialist. One of their all-arounders, Sun Wei, is kind of a head case. He's incredibly inconsistent. Jung Bohang, their best all-arounder, has been injured pretty badly. He had to withdraw from nationals, so no one knows what his status is. And then you have Xiao Ruotung, who's kind of fragile, and they don't really want to put him up in the all-around and team finals. And so it's a really interesting team. It's a strong team with about maybe a 2-point deficit to China or 2-point deficit to Japan. But I think Japan actually has the edge here. I think they have a much more well-rounded team. I think they have built-in backups upon built-in backups. And they're carrying about a 2-point lead of D-score heading into the Olympic Games.
And I think the Chinese have a history of really making a mess of that qualification day at times. So I think, again, they're probably another team a bit like Ukraine that benefit from having the free to count situation in team final. So it's going to be very interesting. I think you're right. I don't think they're a very well-balanced team. Whereas I look at the Japanese team and, again, I don't see any weak spots, really. Everything's covered. Even if they have any issues out there or injuries, I think I would firmly put the Japanese as favourites. Chinese probably below. More so, if I'm honest, more so off reputation more than anything else. I look at that team and it's hard to know. It's a bit of a mystery. And then I think it is a real bunch of GB, America and Ukraine. But, if I was really pushed, I would probably say that I think Ukraine are favourite. I would put Ukraine I would tip them as personal. They've got the advantage, I think, going into the Olympic Games, because if you look at the American team, and the way it's been selected and that team that's been selected and the questions around that. And then the British team being a mystery on who's going to be fit, who's healthy, what kind of state is the team in. I think Ukraine are the most solid. Their team is their team. Like, they compete very well at the Europeans. It's not going to change much in terms of the lineup. It's set. So I would personally tip them, I think, as maybe being the favourites going in. So it'll be very, very interesting. It'll be very, very close, I think, those three teams. One team I wanted to talk about just before we finish. You know, I've had a lot of people commenting recently to talk about Canada a little bit. Obviously, the rise of the Canadian teams. I know that the Canadian team and gymnastics in Canada, as almost like a byproduct of being next to you guys in America, has quite a strong following online as well. So what do you think to the Canadian team? And they've obviously improved massively recently in the last few years. And they've had that kind of like quiet spell for the last maybe 10, 12 years. They, you know, had a very good team in Beijing. What do you make of that team?
Yeah, the team has stated that their goal is team finals. And I think that it's going to be... there are a lot of teams in this sort of like 100 to 101 difficulty. So after those first 5 teams that we talked about, Turkey, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Spain are all sitting in that 100 to 101 range. And I think sort of where the Canadian team is about a 99 in D score. So they're a little bit kind of below, but everyone is that's a close enough range, and those athletes are all well enough matched that I think making team final is doable for them. I'm incredibly impressed with Felix Dulce. I think, first of all, I think his gymnastics is really beautiful. I really like watching him, particularly on floor and high bar. Just the strength of 2 of their athletes who have come back again and again from injury. So Will Amard, right, tore his bicep and then came back and placed 3rd in the all-around at the Canadian National Championships. And then Sam Zakutny had a really bad injury last year in South America. And then for him to come back and make this team, Renee Cornway is their only returning Olympian, and then Zachary Clay, who's going to be there for pommel horse. They're a really, what I take away from this team is that they are tight-knit. They all seem to really like each other. They have like a podcast together. Yeah. And I think that team bond actually matters more than people give it credit for. So we talk about the Ukrainian team, who has had a lot of interpersonal strife in recent years. You have spoken about how you were on teams competing against some of the US teams at that time, and they just felt like groups of individuals. And this team just feels like a cohesive unit that are working towards that goal to return to the Olympic team final. And I think that that's certainly a storyline to watch.
Yeah, I think they're a program to watch. I expect them to continue to improve into the next cycle. Exciting, strong program. I think they've got a lot of good talent. It'd be interesting to know what their junior program's like, what those next guys are that are filtering through. But I think, you know, with the Olympic Games being in America and Canada being close and that kind of stuff, it just all plays a role. So it'll be exciting to see how they develop over the next 4 years.
One other team to mention is Turkey. It's the first time Turkey's ever qualified a team for the Olympic Games. And again, not a team that I think is probably going to be challenging for a medal, but wow, what an accomplishment for them to have done that for the first time. Yeah,
they're massively over punching. Like they have no business really typically being, you know, doing what they're doing and being where they are in terms of, you know, the country, I imagine the resources that they've got. But it shows you just how quickly momentum can pick up if you get one individual that starts to have some success, and then the next one, and then the next one, and that will be where countries like Ireland are hoping that if Reese can go and potentially become an Olympic medalist on pommels, the funding and then in terms of a spotlight on the sport and then encouraging kids to get into gymnastics rather than other sports over in Ireland, that's going to build up, and then you get a few more individuals that start to get some success, and then all of a sudden you've got a team. That's exactly what happened in Great Britain. So it's amazing what they've done. It's interesting. When I first started traveling around Europe and competing internationally, more often than not, if there was a country that had an individual gymnast that was getting some success, you could track it back to a Russian coach. It was very, very, nearly every time there'd be a gymnast from Israel and it'd be a Russian coach, or there'd be a gymnast from Croatia, he's got a Russian coach, and it'd be that knowledge. I think a lot of that knowledge now has been passed down enough to coaches within all of those countries that they can now produce their own gymnasts and homegrown coaches. And so I think that's what has led a lot to that strength and depth within the men's side of the sport. Just to finish off then, Kensley, what are you looking forward to the most in seeing at the Olympic Games in Paris? You're obviously going to be there. What are you excited about watching the most?
I think men's team final.
Okay.
For me, that one, I probably honestly pommel horse final too, which I never thought I would say, but there are so many competitive athletes who could win that. And so those two finals, I think, are going to be the showstoppers.
It would be great. Yeah, I hope everyone makes it into that pommel final. That would be amazing. We've got plans to essentially do like so the morning after the event, so the men's team final, the all-around fine apparatus finals, I'm having one of my old teammates come in and we're basically talking about what happened the night before. So that's really cool. So I'm hoping to have Dan Keaton's in to talk about the pommel horse final afterwards. So that's going to be really cool. So I'm hoping that like everyone makes that final. You want to see the best of the best at the Olympic Games. Max obviously is trying to make history. What an incredible story that would be. I'm convinced he's already going to get a knighthood at some point. He's one of our most successful Olympians in any sport, full stop. So hopefully he's fit, he's healthy, he makes it to the games. He did earn that spot. He does deserve it.
Yeah.
And I would be, you'd be a fool to bet against Max, considering everything. I mean, if there's one person in the world that you want to put up to do a pommel routine under pressure, it's probably him, right? So,
right.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I want to see that showdown between him and Reese and then the other pommel horse specialists who, I have to say, I think we're going to see a lot of the World Cup qualifiers who took those top spots be in contention for medals. I think the way that they constructed that World Cup qualification circuit has funneled and it's created some incredibly strong contenders for medals because it was so hard to get those two spots, particularly on pommel horse. Those two guys that took those spots, they can score so high. Their execution is incredibly high. So very excited to see all of those gymnasts. Obviously, the Japanese team will be a big favourite. The Colombian gymnast, Angel, I think, 17 years old, very, very exciting. Excited to see him on the international stage, but it's going to be amazing, man. I'm like you, I can't wait to watch the team file. It's going to be awesome. But yeah, Kensley, thank you so much. Thank you for, we didn't really touch on it, but the articles this week that I saw come out from you, the average ages of the teams, I thought that was brilliant. I really enjoyed reading that. It would be great to know if the average age of those teams in past Olympic Games and team finals has correlated to medals. So whether the gold medalists have typically been older and where they sit in that, or younger, that would be interesting to know. But yeah, it's been brilliant. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep bringing us that content. I rely on it heavily. I know that a lot of my friends do who are excited and very much gymnastics fans or from the gymternet, like you said. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming on today. Hope people enjoy this episode. And just to finish off, Kensley, where can people go to find more of your analysis, the articles that you write, your content, obviously your own podcast? Just tell us quickly.
Yeah, everything is on Neutral Deductions. So neutraldeductions.com for the website. We're on Facebook and Instagram. And the only thing that's different is Twitter or X, however you prefer to call it. That's Kensley, Anne.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Kensley. And have an amazing time in Paris. I'm very jealous.
Thank you.